On the morning of September 14, 1856, servants discovered the bodies of Catherine Grimball, wife of Circuit Court Judge Nathaniel Grimball, and a man named Isaiah, enslaved on the Grimball plantation, locked together in death in the judge's own study. The scandal rocked Charleston society to its foundation. 47 prominent citizens signed a petition demanding the case files be sealed permanently. 3 witnesses died within 6 months of the discovery, all from seemingly natural causes. The official coroner's report, stored in the Charleston County Archives, contains only 4 lines, unusual for such a prominent case. What those 4 lines don't mention, what the sealed depositions reveal, is that Catherine Grimball had been dead for nearly 12 hours before Isaiah's body was placed beside hers. Before we continue with the story of the Grimball family and the conspiracy that consumed them, I want to ask you something. Have you ever heard whispers of secrets in your own city, stories that were too dangerous to tell? Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us what state or city you're watching from. Let's discover together what really happened in that study on Meeting Street. The truth about that September morning would take decades to fully emerge, and when it did, it revealed something far more terrifying than a forbidden affair. Charleston in 1856 stood at the precipice of transformation, though few acknowledged the tremors beneath their feet. The city's cobblestone streets bore the weight of carriages carrying men and women who believed their world immutable, their society ordained by divine providence. Along the Battery, grand homes faced the harbor with the confidence of permanence, their piazzas shaded against the brutal southern sun, their gardens tended by hands that would never own the soil they cultivated. Judge Nathaniel Grimball occupied one of these homes, a 3-story structure on Meeting Street distinguished by its elaborate ironwork and the ancient live oak that dominated the front garden. At 49, Nathaniel represented the 3rd generation of Grimballs to practice law in Charleston. His grandfather had signed the state constitution. His father had served in Congress. Nathaniel himself presided over the circuit court with a reputation for fairness that made him unusual among his peers. He had, on 2 occasions, ruled against fellow plantation owners in cases involving the treatment of enslaved people, decisions that earned him respect from some quarters and suspicion from others. His wife, Catherine, had been Catherine Rutledge before their marriage 26 years earlier. The Rutledges claimed lineage back to the colonial governors, and Catherine had been raised with the understanding that her primary duty was to maintain the dignity of both families. She performed this role with grace, hosting the necessary dinners, attending the proper churches, serving on the committees that organized charitable works for the poor whites of Charleston. Those who knew her well noted a certain melancholy in her bearing, a distance in her gaze during even the most animated social gatherings. Some attributed this to the loss of her only child, a daughter who had died of fever at age 7, 16 years before our story begins. Others whispered about different sorrows, though never loudly enough to be overheard. The Grimball household maintained 37 enslaved people across their Meeting Street home and their rice plantation on the Ashley River. Isaiah, 28 years old in 1856, had been born on the plantation but brought to the city residence 5 years earlier to serve as the judge's personal valet and driver. He was literate, which was illegal and dangerous, having been taught to read by Catherine herself during the years when she still believed she might change her world through small acts of defiance. Tall and composed, Isaiah moved through the Grimball house with the careful dignity of someone always aware of being watched, always conscious that any moment might require explanation. The household also included Dinah, who had served as Catherine's lady's maid for 18 years, and Samuel, the elderly butler who had belonged to Nathaniel's father and now managed the daily operations of the house with quiet authority. These 3, Isaiah, Dinah, and Samuel, would become crucial witnesses to events that none of them fully understood, testifying to fragments of truth that, when assembled, revealed a picture none could have imagined. Charleston's high society in 1856 operated according to codes as rigid as they were unspoken. The Grimball family moved within a social circle that included the Ravenels, the Pinckneys, the Prioleaus, and other families whose names adorned the membership rolls of the St. Cecilia Society. These were people who could trace their Charleston roots back generations, who married within their circle, who maintained appearances even as financial pressures mounted, and the national political situation grew increasingly unstable. Among these families, the Vanderhorsts occupied a peculiar position. Marcus Vanderhorst, also a lawyer, had long harbored ambitions for the circuit court bench that Nathaniel occupied. The two men had been acquaintances since childhood, but never friends. Marcus practiced a more aggressive style of law, representing the interests of the largest plantations, defending their rights with an ideological fervor that made him popular among the most extreme voices in Charleston society. He often appeared at social gatherings with his wife Eleanor, a brittle woman whose smile never reached her eyes, and their son Peter, who at 24 had already developed a reputation for drinking and gambling that concerned even his father. The summer of 1856 had been particularly oppressive, with temperatures reaching heights that sent those who could afford it fleeing to the mountains of North Carolina or the relative coolness of Sullivan's Island. The Grimballs, however, had remained in the city. Nathaniel was hearing a complex case involving a disputed inheritance that required his presence in court throughout August and September. Catherine had cited the need to oversee renovations to their plantation house, though servants later testified that she had visited the property only twice during those months. On September 10th, 4 days before the bodies were discovered, Marcus Vanderhorst had hosted a dinner at his home on Trad Street. The guest list included the Grimballs, several other prominent lawyers, a state senator, and a visiting journalist from Richmond who was writing a series of articles defending Southern institutions. The dinner conversation had turned, as it often did in those days, to politics. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Sumner Assault, the growing boldness of abolitionists in the North. According to witnesses who attended, Nathaniel had been unusually quiet during these discussions. When pressed by Marcus for his opinion on a proposed state law that would make teaching enslaved people to read a crime punishable by imprisonment, Nathaniel had responded with characteristic precision. The law as proposed is redundant. We already prohibit such instruction. Adding imprisonment suggests we cannot enforce our existing statutes, which hardly project strength. It was a careful answer, neither endorsing nor condemning, but several guests noticed Marcus's expression harden. Peter Vanderhorst, already several glasses deep into his father's brandy, had laughed and said something about soft judges making soft law, earning a sharp look from his father, but nervous chuckles from others at the table. Catherine had excused herself early, claiming a headache. Isaiah had been summoned to bring the carriage around, and witnesses later recalled seeing Catherine standing on the Vanderhorst piazza while she waited, staring out at the darkened street, with an expression one guest described as, like a prisoner counting the stones in her cell. The next 3 days passed in what appeared to be routine fashion. Nathaniel presided over court sessions. Catherine received a visit from her sister, managed household affairs, attended a meeting of the Ladies' Benevolent Society. But servants later testified to subtle disturbances in the household's normal rhythm. Dinah noticed that Catherine seemed distracted, often staring at nothing, sometimes startling when addressed. Samuel mentioned that the judge had received several visitors in his study during the evenings, meetings that were unusual because they happened after dinner, and involved men who normally would not have called at such hours. On the evening of September 13th, the household followed its standard routine. Dinner was served at 7. The judge and his wife ate largely in silence, Dinah later recalled, with Catherine barely touching her food. At 8:30, Nathaniel retired to his study to review documents related to the inheritance case. Catherine went to her sitting room on the second floor, where she normally spent her evenings reading or doing needlework. Isaiah was dismissed for the night after helping the judge into his smoking jacket and ensuring the study fire was properly laid. Samuel locked the doors at 9:30, as he did every night, and the household settled into sleep. What happened during the next several hours would be reconstructed only partially from physical evidence and conflicting testimonies. But certain facts remained indisputable. At some point between 9:30 that evening and dawn, Catherine Grimball died in her husband's study, and sometime after her death, Isaiah's body was placed beside hers in a tableau designed to suggest a secret affair interrupted by violence. The morning of September 14th dawned clear and already warm, promising another sweltering day. Samuel rose at his customary 5:30 to begin opening the house, drawing back curtains, opening windows to catch what little breeze moved through the city's streets. At 6, he knocked on the study door to wake the judge, as he had done every morning for 20 years. When no response came, he knocked again. The door was locked from inside, which was unusual but not unprecedented. The judge sometimes locked himself in when working late on particularly sensitive cases. By 6:30, with still no response, Samuel's concern deepened. He fetched the spare key that hung in the butler's pantry, and after hesitating at the threshold, unlocked and opened the study door. The study faced east, catching the early morning sun through tall windows that overlooked the garden. As light streamed into the room, Samuel saw Catherine first. She lay on the Turkish carpet beside the judge's desk, on her back, still wearing the grey silk dress she had worn to dinner the previous evening. Her hands were folded over her stomach in an attitude of peaceful repose that seemed carefully arranged. Her eyes were closed, her expression calm, almost serene. Isaiah lay beside her, positioned on his side as if he had fallen while reaching toward her. He wore the dark trousers and white shirt that comprised his work clothes, but his feet were bare. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and his right hand extended toward Catherine's shoulder, though not quite touching it. Between them, clearly placed rather than dropped, lay an empty laudanum bottle. Samuel stood in the doorway for what he later described as time outside of time, his mind refusing to assemble what his eyes showed him into any coherent narrative. The desk bore evidence of work. Papers spread across its surface, the judge's reading glasses lying atop an open ledger, a glass of whiskey barely touched. The room smelled of tobacco, lamp oil, and something else Samuel couldn't immediately identify. A sweet, cloying scent that seemed to hang in the air. No blood, no signs of struggle. No overturned furniture or scattered papers beyond the normal disorder of the judge's work. The locked door. The morning light revealing two bodies posed as if for a portrait of tragedy. Samuel finally found his voice and called for Dinah. When she appeared at the stairs, her expression shifting from concern to horror as she took in the scene, he instructed her to wake the judge immediately and to allow no one else to enter the study. Dinah hurried upstairs while Samuel remained at the threshold, unable to enter, unable to leave, anchored by the impossibility of what he was seeing. Nathaniel appeared within minutes, wearing his dressing gown, his face already settling into the composed mask he wore in court. He moved past Samuel into the study, and for a long moment stood perfectly still, looking down at the bodies of his wife and his valet. Samuel later testified that the judge's only visible reaction was a slight tremor in his hands, quickly controlled. "Send for Dr. Huger," Nathaniel said, his voice steady. "Then send for Sheriff Pembroke. Speak to no one else. Allow no one to enter this room until they arrive. Is that clear?" Samuel nodded. Nathaniel turned back to the bodies, and as Samuel left to follow his instructions, he heard the judge say something in a voice so low it was almost inaudible. "Forgive me, Catherine. God forgive me. Forgive me. Dr." Benjamin Huger arrived first, at 7:15. A portly man of 60 who had attended the Grimball family for decades, he entered the study with his medical bag and emerged 20 minutes later, his face pale and sheened with sweat despite the morning hour. He spoke briefly with the judge in the hallway, their conversation too quiet for others to overhear, then departed with unusual haste, saying he needed to retrieve certain instruments. Sheriff Thomas Pembroke arrived shortly after 8, accompanied by his deputy, a young man named William Drayson. The sheriff was a political appointee, chosen more for his family connections than his investigative abilities, and he approached the scene with visible discomfort. He spent perhaps 10 minutes in the study, during which servants heard him asking questions of the judge in a deferential tone, more suited to a social call than an investigation. When the sheriff emerged, he gathered the household staff in the front parlor. His questions were perfunctory. Had anyone heard anything unusual during the night? Had anyone seen Mrs. Grimble or Isaiah after 9:30? Did anyone know of any prior relationship between the deceased? Samuel, Dinah, and the other servants responded with careful precision. No unusual sounds. Mrs. Grimble had retired to her sitting room. Isaiah had gone to his quarters above the carriage house. No one mentioned the tension they had sensed in recent days, the whispered conversations they had overheard, the fact that Catherine had seemed increasingly withdrawn. Survival in a slave-owning household meant knowing what questions to answer and what truths to keep silent. By mid-morning, word of the tragedy had begun spreading through Charleston society with the speed of fire through dry kindling. Visitors arrived at the Meeting Street house, ostensibly to offer condolences, but clearly eager for details. Nathaniel refused to see anyone, remaining in his private chambers. Dr. Hugo returned briefly, entering through the rear of the house, and departed again without speaking to the assembled staff. The bodies were removed late that afternoon, transported to the coroner's facility on Queen Street. No public announcement was made. No notice appeared in the Charleston newspapers. The study door was locked, and would remain locked for the next 3 weeks. That evening, as servants prepared a dinner that no one would eat, Dinah was summoned to the judge's private study, a smaller room on the second floor, separate from the death scene. She found Nathaniel seated at his desk, but he was not working. He simply sat, staring at nothing, his hands folded before him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that frightened Dinah more than any anger could have. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Not what you think I want to hear. The truth. Did Catherine and Isaiah have an affection for each other?" Dinah considered her response carefully. In this house, with this judge, the truth might be safer than a lie. "Mrs. Catherine taught Isaiah to read, sir. Years ago, when he was just a boy. They talked about books sometimes, about ideas, but it was like a teacher and a student, sir. Nothing else. I swear it on my life." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. That's what I needed to hear from someone I trust." He paused, and when he continued, his words chilled Dinah to her core. "What happened in that study wasn't what it appears to be. I know this, but proving it, that's a different matter entirely. Be careful, Dinah. Be very careful who you speak to in the coming days. There are people who want a particular story told, and they don't care about the truth." The official coroner's report, completed on September 16th, consisted of 4 lines. Catherine Grimble and Isaiah, Negro male, found deceased September 14th, 1856. Cause of death, laudanum poisoning. Manner, appears to be murder-suicide or suicide pact. Case closed. The brevity was stunning for a case involving one of Charleston's most prominent families. No detailed examination of the bodies, no reconstruction of events, no consideration of alternative explanations, just 4 lines and a case sealed. Within days, a petition began circulating among Charleston's elite. 47 prominent citizens eventually signed it, including 3 other judges, 2 state senators, and the mayor himself. The petition requested that all documents related to the Grimble case be sealed indefinitely, citing the dignity of the deceased and the preservation of public morality. The request was granted by a special session of the court held behind closed doors, presided over by Judge Horatio Priolo, Nathaniel's colleague and supposed friend. The case files, including witness testimonies, the coroner's preliminary notes, and any physical evidence, were placed in a sealed box and stored in the courthouse vault, accessible only by court order. Nathaniel Grimble did not attend the sealing proceedings. He had withdrawn entirely from public life immediately following the deaths, taking a leave of absence from his judicial duties. The Grimble house on Meeting Street remained shuttered, its windows covered, no smoke rising from its chimneys. Servants reported that the judge stayed primarily in his upstairs chambers, seeing no one, eating little, spending hours writing in journals that he allowed no one to read. In the quarters above the carriage house, where Isaiah had lived, his few possessions were quietly removed by other enslaved members of the household. Among these items, a Bible with margin notes in Isaiah's careful handwriting, 3 books of poetry, a writing tablet filled with observations about Charleston's gardens, and a leather-bound journal that would not be discovered until years later, hidden beneath a floorboard. Catherine Grimball was buried in the family plot at Magnolia Cemetery on September 17th. The funeral was a small, private affair, unusual for someone of her social standing. Nathaniel attended, supported by his brother Samuel, who had traveled from Georgia. Catherine's sister was there, her face hidden behind heavy mourning veils, weeping throughout the brief service. Notably absent were most of the Rutledge family and many of the Grimballs' usual social circle. Charleston society had already begun its judgment. Isaiah was buried the same day in the enslaved section of the cemetery, far from the Grimball plot. No service was held. No marker was placed. Within a month, even the location of his grave would be forgotten, his existence reduced to an entry in the Grimball plantation ledgers. Isaiah, deceased September 1856, loss valued at $1,200. The whispers started immediately. In parlors across Charleston, in the market, at church gatherings, people who had never exchanged more than pleasantries with Catherine Grimball suddenly claimed intimate knowledge of her character. She had always seemed melancholy, they said. There had been something strange about her, something not quite right. The way she sometimes looked at her slaves, with too much recognition, too much sympathy. And that Isaiah, hadn't there been something presumptuous about him? The way he carried himself, the way he looked people in the eye. Clearly, there had been something illicit going on, something immoral, and it had led to this inevitable tragedy. Others, a quieter minority, questioned the official narrative. Why would Catherine, who had never shown any sign of romantic attachment to Isaiah, suddenly conduct an affair so carelessly? Why would Isaiah, who understood better than anyone the consequences of such an accusation, risk not only his own life, but the safety of everyone in the Grimball household? Why was the coroner's report so abbreviated? Why were the case files sealed? But these questions were asked only in the most private conversations, and even then with nervous glances toward doors and windows. Charleston in 1856 was not a place where challenging the prevailing narrative was safe, particularly when that narrative served to reinforce existing social structures and beliefs. 3 weeks after the deaths, Marcus Vanderhorst visited the Grimball house, arriving early in the morning unannounced. Samuel, who answered the door, tried to turn him away, explaining that the judge was receiving no visitors. But Marcus insisted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected compliance. "Tell Judge Grimball that I have information he needs to hear. Tell him it concerns the events of September 14th. Tell him I'm here as a friend." The judge received him in the upstairs study. Their conversation lasted nearly an hour, and though servants could not hear the words, they heard the tone. Marcus's voice, initially measured and sympathetic, gradually rising to something more insistent, almost threatening. Nathaniel's responses came less frequently and quieter. When Marcus finally left, Samuel noted that his expression carried satisfaction, like a lawyer who had won an important concession. That same afternoon, Nathaniel emerged from his self-imposed isolation. He called Samuel and Dinah to the study and spoke to them with a composure that seemed forced, artificial. "I am returning to my duties on Monday," he announced. "The house will reopen. We will resume normal operations. The past must remain past. Do you understand?" But before dismissing them, he added something else, speaking directly to Dinah. "You asked me once, years ago, why I didn't free you. Why I didn't free any of you. Do you remember what I said?" Dinah nodded. He had told her that freedom papers meant nothing in Charleston, that they could be challenged, revoked, ignored. that she was safer as his property, under his protection, than she would be carrying papers that any constable might declare fraudulent. "I was wrong," Nathaniel said now, his voice hollow. "I told myself I was protecting you, but I was really protecting myself. Protecting my position, my reputation, my place in a society that I should have challenged instead of accommodated. And now Catherine is dead and Isaiah is dead and I—" He stopped, seeming to realize he had said too much. "Be careful, Dinah. Trust no one, not even me." Judge Nathaniel Grimball returned to the Circuit Court bench on October 1st, 1856, exactly 17 days after the deaths. His colleagues welcomed him back with expressions of sympathy that seemed rehearsed, hollow. Court proceedings resumed, and for several weeks life appeared to return to its previous rhythms. But those who knew Nathaniel well noticed changes. He had lost weight. His face had acquired new lines, and there was a hardness in his eyes that had not been there before. In early November, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the courthouse, addressed to Judge Grimball but intercepted by his clerk, a young man named Daniel Ravenel, whose family connections had secured him the position. The letter bore no return address and had been posted from Columbia. Daniel, following what he later claimed were his duties, opened and read the letter before presenting it to the judge. The letter's contents were brief but explosive. "Judge Grimball, I was Dr. Huger's assistant on September 14th. What I observed in your study contradicts the official report. The positioning of the bodies, the rigor mortis, the lividity patterns, nothing matched a simultaneous death or even deaths within the same hour. I kept silent because I was told to, but my conscience troubles me. I am leaving South Carolina. Consider this my testimony to truth, whatever good it may do. James Thornton." Daniel Ravenel immediately took the letter to Marcus Vanderhorst, not to Judge Grimball. This fact would later prove significant. Marcus called an emergency meeting of several prominent attorneys and judges that very evening, held at his office on Broad Street. Nathaniel was invited, though it was clear he was being summoned rather than consulted. According to later testimony from a clerk who overheard portions of the meeting, Marcus had presented the letter as evidence of a potential scandal. Not the scandal of September 14th, but the scandal of a cover-up. "If this Thornton fellow starts talking in Columbia, or God forbid writes to northern newspapers, we'll have abolitionists swarming Charleston, calling this another example of Southern immorality," Marcus argued. "We need to contain this. We need to ensure that the official story remains unchallenged." The response he proposed: "Pressure, Doctor Huger to provide a more detailed report affirming the murder-suicide theory, locate and silence James Thornton through whatever means necessary, and ensure that no other witnesses felt compelled to speak out." Several men in the room agreed. But Nathaniel, according to the clerk's account, stood and spoke for the first time that evening. "Or," he said, his voice cutting through the discussion, "we could acknowledge that there are questions about what happened that night. We could reopen the investigation. We could seek truth instead of convenience." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus finally responded, his voice carrying both pity and warning. "Nathaniel, I understand you're grieving, but you need to consider what you're suggesting. A reinvestigation would require examining Catherine's reputation in detail. It would require questioning the household staff, including your slaves, in ways that might produce testimony that, well, that might be even more damaging than the current narrative. Sometimes, difficult as it may be, we must accept that certain truths are better left undisturbed." Nathaniel left the meeting shortly after, and according to Samuel, who waited with the carriage, the judge's hands shook as he climbed inside. That night, Nathaniel did something he had never done before. He summoned Dinah and Samuel to his study and spoke to them as equals, not as property. "I need to know what you know," he said. "Not what you think it's safe to tell me. Everything. Catherine's state of mind in the days before her death, any unusual visitors, any conversations you might have overheard. I know you've been protecting me, protecting yourselves. But protection through silence is no longer enough." What followed was a conversation that lasted past midnight. Dinah revealed that Catherine had received letters in the weeks before her death, letters that arrived with no return address, that Catherine read and immediately burned in the fireplace. She described how Catherine had become increasingly withdrawn, more fearful, often checking the windows as if expecting someone. Samuel mentioned the late-night visitors to Nathaniel's study, meetings that had disturbed the household's routines. He named the visitors. Marcus Vanderhorst had come twice, Peter Vanderhorst once, and on September 12th, 2 nights before the deaths, Sheriff Pembroke himself had spent an hour in the study with the judge. Nathaniel listened to all of this with the focused attention he brought to court testimony. When they finished, he asked one more question. Do you believe Catherine and Isaiah died together by their own choice? Both Dinah and Samuel shook their heads. No, sir, Dinah said firmly. Mrs. Catherine would never have done that. She was sad, yes, but not that kind of sad. And Isaiah, he was cautious, always careful. He would never have risked himself or anyone else in this house. That's what I believe too, Nathaniel said, which means someone else killed them. And worse, I think I know why. The conspiracy that Judge Nathaniel Grimball began to uncover in those November weeks of 1856 stretched back years and involved some of Charleston's most respected citizens. It centered on money, power, and the upcoming state elections, elements far more dangerous than any forbidden romance. In late 1855, a large tract of land north of Charleston, nearly 3,000 acres, had come up for sale following the death of its owner, Colonel Henry Beaumont, who left no direct heirs. The land was valuable, prime soil for cotton, with river access that made transportation efficient. Multiple parties expressed interest, but the estate settlement was complicated by conflicting wills and disputed claims from distant relatives. The case landed on Nathaniel Grimball's court docket in February 1856. As he reviewed the documents, he discovered irregularities, signatures that appeared forged, witness testimonies that contradicted each other, and most troubling, evidence suggesting that certain parties had known about Colonel Beaumont's death before it was publicly announced and had begun maneuvering to acquire the land immediately. Among those parties, a consortium that included Marcus Vanderhorst, Sheriff Thomas Pembroke, and 3 other prominent Charleston attorneys. They had formed an investment group with the intention of purchasing the Beaumont land, subdividing it, and reselling it at enormous profit. Their plan required that the estate sale proceed quickly, without extensive legal challenges, and that certain competing claims be dismissed. Nathaniel had been expected to facilitate this. As a fellow member of Charleston's elite, as someone who understood how business was conducted, he should have recognized his role and played it appropriately. Instead, he had done something unthinkable. He had begun a legitimate, thorough investigation of the estate documents. He had discovered the forgeries. He had uncovered evidence suggesting that Colonel Beaumont's death might not have been from natural causes as reported, but from poison administered over several months. And he had scheduled a hearing for September 30th, 1856, at which these findings would be presented publicly. Catherine had learned about this in early September. The letters Dinah mentioned, the ones Catherine burned, they had been warnings, thinly veiled threats, suggesting that certain actions would have consequences for the Grimball family. Catherine had tried to convince Nathaniel to drop the investigation, to rule in favor of the consortium, to preserve their safety. But Nathaniel, believing in law and justice with a faith that now seemed tragically naive, had refused. On the evening of September 13th, Marcus Vanderhorst and Sheriff Pembroke had visited Nathaniel's study for a final conversation. They presented him with a choice blunt and terrifying in its clarity. Dismiss the competing claims, rule in favor of the consortium's acquisition, and receive compensation that would make him wealthy beyond his current means. Refuse and face consequences. Not threats, they emphasized, just realities. Evidence could be manufactured, reputations destroyed, accidents arranged. Nathaniel had refused. According to what he later wrote in his journal, the journal found years later during the renovation of the Meeting Street house, he had stood on principle, believing that his position as a judge and his family name would protect him. "I told them to get out of my house," he wrote. "I told them I would see them in court as defendants when I referred their conspiracy to the grand jury." Marcus smiled, and that smile told me I had made a terrible mistake. What happened next? In those dark hours after the household went to sleep, Nathaniel reconstructed from physical evidence and from a confession he eventually extracted from someone close to the conspiracy. Catherine had been murdered first, killed in her sitting room with a dose of laudanum so concentrated that death would have come quickly. Her body had then been carried down to the study. Isaiah, who had quarters above the carriage house, would have been easy to lure with a message supposedly from the judge. Once in the study, he was murdered as well. Again with laudanum, but administered differently, violently, which explained the open eyes and the reaching position of his death. The scene had been staged carefully, the emptied laudanum bottle placed between them, Catherine's dress arranged to suggest she had come to the study willingly, Isaiah positioned to imply an interrupted encounter. The study door had been locked from inside, the key left in place, to suggest that the two had sought privacy for their final moments together. Every detail calculated to create a narrative that Charleston society would not only believe, but would want to believe. A narrative that reinforced every prejudice and fear about racial mixing and moral transgression. The plan had been brilliant in its cruelty. It silenced Nathaniel's investigation by destroying his moral authority. What judge could prosecute a land fraud case while his own wife lay under a cloud of scandal? It sent a message to anyone else who might consider challenging the consortium's interests. And it did all this while technically committing no crime that could be easily proven. Murder dressed as scandal, political assassination disguised as tragedy. But the conspirators had made mistakes. James Thornton, Dr. Huger's assistant, had noticed the timing inconsistencies in the body's conditions. The laudanum bottle, though empty, bore a pharmacist's mark that Nathaniel traced to a specific Charleston chemist who reluctantly admitted filling an unusually large prescription for Marcus Vanderhorst's son, Peter, just days before the deaths. And someone had talked, not openly, not directly, but in whispers that reached the right ears. By mid-November, Nathaniel had assembled enough evidence to present to a grand jury. Not proof. Not quite. But enough to raise serious questions. Enough to force a real investigation. He prepared his materials carefully, made copies which he stored in different locations, and scheduled a meeting with the State Attorney General for December 1st. He never made that meeting. On the evening of November 28, 1856, fire broke out in the Grimball house on Meeting Street. The fire started simultaneously in 3 different locations, a pattern that even the primitive fire investigation techniques of the era recognized as arson. The house burned completely, and though servants escaped, Nathaniel Grimball did not. His body was found in the upstairs study, where he had been working when the flames began. The door to that study had been locked from outside. The key was never recovered. Within days, 3 more deaths occurred. Samuel, the elderly butler, died of what was called a heart seizure while walking near the market. Dinah disappeared entirely and was never seen again. Later rumors suggested she had escaped to the north, but no confirmation ever emerged. And Peter Vanderhorst, Marcus's dissolute son, died of what his father claimed was accidental laudanum poisoning, though many suspected Marcus had silenced his own son to eliminate the connection to the earlier murders. The Beaumont estate case was reassigned to Judge Horatio Priolo, who ruled in favor of the consortium within a week. The land was purchased, subdivided, and sold. The profits made several Charleston families very wealthy. And the story of the Grimball tragedy entered Charleston's historical memory as a cautionary tale about forbidden desires and inevitable justice, not as an account of conspiracy and murder. The full truth about September 14, 1856, did not emerge until decades later, long after everyone directly involved had died. In 1889, during renovations to the home that had been rebuilt on the Meeting Street property where the Grimball house once stood, Workers discovered a metal box hidden in the foundation. Inside were papers, copies of the documents Nathaniel had prepared for the Attorney General, his personal journals detailing the conspiracy, and something else, a confession. The discovery happened on a humid afternoon in late June. The construction foreman, a man named Thomas Becket, who had no connection to any of the families involved in the original tragedy, had been overseeing the installation of new support beams in the basement when one of his workers' pickaxe struck something that rang with a metallic sound. Curious, Becket ordered the area carefully excavated. What emerged was a sealed iron box, approximately 12 inches square, its surface marked with rust, but its seal still intact. Becket, being a cautious man and aware that he was working on a property with historical significance, did not open the box immediately. Instead, he contacted the property's owner, Mr. Jonathan Hayward, a Charleston merchant who had purchased the lot and commissioned the renovation with plans to convert it into a boarding house. Hayward, in turn, recognizing that the box might contain items of historical or monetary value, brought it to the Charleston Historical Society, where it was opened in the presence of 3 witnesses. Hayward himself, the Society's director, Dr. William Ravenel, a distant cousin of the Ravenel family, but with no close ties to the events of 1856, and a local attorney named Samuel Clifton. The moment the box was opened, its contents revealed a story that the 3 men realized would shake Charleston's understanding of its own past. The papers inside were remarkably well preserved, protected by the iron container and the dry conditions of their hiding place. At the top of the stack lay a letter addressed to whoever finds this box, written in a feminine hand that was later identified as belonging to Eleanor Vanderhorst. The letter explained that Eleanor had written her full confession in 1872, 16 years after the murders, as her health declined and death approached. She had entrusted the document to her pastor, Reverend Thomas Gadsden of St. Michael's Church, with specific instructions. He was to hold the confession for 15 years after her death, then decide what to do with it, based on whether those who might be harmed by its revelation were still living. Reverend Gadsden, who died in 1888, had apparently chosen to hide the documents rather than destroy them or make them public, perhaps unable to bear either the burden of destroying truth or the responsibility of revealing it. Eleanor's confession was written across 23 pages in her careful, educated script. She began with a statement that revealed the depth of her torment. "I write this as a dying woman who has lived too long with terrible knowledge. I am a coward, for I write these words only when death makes me safe from earthly consequences. But perhaps cowardice that preserves truth is better than courage that maintains lies. Let God judge me, for I can no longer judge myself." She detailed how the conspiracy had begun in January 1856, when Marcus Vanderhorst and Sheriff Pembroke first learned that Judge Grimball was conducting a thorough investigation into the Beaumont estate case, rather than the perfunctory review they had expected. They had met at the Vanderhorst home on Trad Street. Eleanor remembered because she had been asked to ensure the servants were out of earshot, a request that had struck her as unusual and concerning. "I stood in the hallway outside Marcus's study," Eleanor wrote, "and I heard them discuss Judge Grimball as one might discuss a business problem requiring a solution. There was no anger in their voices, no passion. They spoke of destroying a man's life with the same tone they might use to discuss the weather or the price of cotton. That coldness frightened me more than any rage could have." The plan had developed over the following weeks. Initially, they hoped to pressure Nathaniel through financial incentives or professional influence. When those approaches failed, they considered other options. Eleanor described how Marcus had brought Peter into the conspiracy reluctantly, recognizing that his son's weakness for alcohol and gambling had left him financially dependent and therefore controllable. Peter owed debts across Charleston, some to dangerous men, and Marcus offered to clear those debts in exchange for his son's participation in what he called a necessary action to protect the family's interests. Eleanor's account of the night of September 13th was particularly detailed, suggesting she had heard the plan discussed multiple times and had perhaps even witnessed some of the preparations. She described how Peter and two men employed by Sheriff Pembroke, she named them as Daniel Rutledge and James Colleton, both of whom had died in the war years later, had entered the Grimball house through a basement entrance that opened onto a small courtyard. This entrance was secured by a simple latch that could be opened from outside with a thin blade, a vulnerability that Marcus had learned about from casual conversation with Catherine Grimball at a social function months earlier. They carried laudanum, Eleanor wrote, purchased in quantities from 3 different pharmacists to avoid suspicion, and mixed into a concentration that would kill quickly. They also carried laudanum in smaller doses, meant to sedate rather than kill, in case they encountered servants who needed to be silenced temporarily. Marcus had planned for every contingency except one, that the weight of what they were about to do might prove too heavy for any of them to carry afterward. The murderers had moved through the dark house with knowledge of its layout. Marcus had visited often enough to guide them through his descriptions. They found Catherine in her sitting room, reading by lamplight as was her custom. When she looked up and saw men she did not know entering her private space, she had only a moment to register fear before Peter Rutledge covered her mouth while James Colleton forced the poisoned laudanum down her throat. Eleanor described this clinically, without emotion, as if distance from feeling made the truth easier to tell. Catherine struggled, Eleanor wrote, and in her struggle she knocked over the lamp on the table beside her chair. Peter caught it before it could fall and start a fire, but the act of catching it, of preventing that accidental chaos while deliberately committing murder, struck him with the full horror of what he was doing. He vomited in the hallway afterward, Marcus told me later, and had to be reminded sharply that he could not fall apart until the work was finished. They had waited with Catherine's body for nearly 2 hours, ensuring she was dead, and that her body had cooled sufficiently to make timing the deaths difficult. During this wait, Eleanor noted they searched Catherine's sitting room and found letters, the threatening letters that Catherine had burned, or thought she had burned. One had fallen behind the fireplace grate, unburned, and they took it as evidence of their caution in using messages that could not be traced back to them. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, Daniel Rutledge went to the quarters above the carriage house where Isaiah slept. He carried a note written on paper taken from the judge's own desk, in handwriting that roughly approximated Nathaniel's script. Isaiah, I require your assistance in the study immediately. Come quickly and quietly. Do not wake the household. N.G. Isaiah, as expected, came immediately. He trusted the judge completely, and the note's request for speed and quiet suggested some emergency that required discretion. When he entered the study through the door the conspirators had left unlocked from inside, he found not Judge Grimball but 3 men who grabbed him before he could call out or flee. Eleanor's description of what followed was the most difficult section of her confession to read. Isaiah had fought them with desperate strength, understanding immediately that he was facing death, and that his death would serve some purpose beyond simple murder. They had to force the laudanum into him, holding him down while Peter Vanderhorst poured the poison into his mouth and clamped his jaw shut until he swallowed. The struggle took several minutes, and Isaiah's final moments were spent in terror and betrayal, dying in a room where he had served faithfully, killed by men whose names he probably knew from hearing them announced at social functions. Peter told his father later, Eleanor wrote, that Isaiah's eyes remained open and aware even as the laudanum began to work, that he seemed to be trying to understand why, what he had done to deserve this. Peter said those eyes haunted him, that he saw them every night when he tried to sleep, that he could not escape the memory of that desperate, confused gaze. I believe this is why Peter descended into the laudanum addiction that eventually killed him, whether by his own hand or his father's. He was trying to escape what he had seen in Isaiah's dying eyes. After Isaiah died, the men arranged both bodies in the study according to Marcus's instructions. Catherine was positioned peacefully, as if she had died at rest. Isaiah was placed reaching toward her, his position suggesting intimacy interrupted. The empty laudanum bottle was carefully placed between them, positioned where it would be noticed immediately. They spent perhaps 20 minutes adjusting the scene, making certain that every detail supported the narrative they needed. A secret affair, a suicide pact or murder-suicide, a scandal that would destroy any moral authority Nathaniel Grimble might claim. Before leaving, they locked the study door from inside, using the key kept in the desk drawer, then exited through the study window, which opened onto the garden and could be secured from outside by someone who knew the mechanism. They left no signs of forced entry, no evidence of their presence beyond the bodies themselves, arranged in their terrible tableau. Eleanor's confession then addressed the aftermath. She described how Marcus had returned home near dawn, his clothes changed, his manner composed, and had told her simply, "It's done. The problem is resolved." When she asked what he meant, he had looked at her with an expression she described as utterly empty, as if something human had been removed and replaced with pure calculation. "I knew in that moment," Eleanor wrote, "that my husband had become something I no longer recognized. Or perhaps worse, that I was finally seeing clearly what he had always been beneath the surface of respectability and charm." I asked no more questions that morning, but in the days that followed, as the scandal spread, and I watched the official narrative take shape, I understood piece by piece what had been done. She described her growing horror as the plan's genius became clear. Nathaniel Grimble, confronted with the staged scene of his wife's infidelity and death, was paralyzed. To investigate the murders honestly would require him to subject Catherine's reputation to intense scrutiny, to allow lawyers and officials to examine every aspect of her life, her character, her relationships. The conspirators knew that Nathaniel would choose to protect Catherine's memory over pursuing justice, at least initially, giving them time to consolidate their position and destroy evidence. But they had underestimated Nathaniel's combination of grief and determination. Eleanor revealed that Marcus had been shocked when he learned, through sources in the courthouse, that the judge was quietly assembling evidence of the conspiracy. Marcus had believed that the scandal would be sufficient, Eleanor wrote, that no man would risk further tarnishing his wife's name by suggesting her death was anything other than what it appeared. He had not anticipated that Nathaniel would sacrifice everything, including Catherine's reputation, for the sake of truth. The decision to kill Nathaniel had been made in late November, during another meeting at the Vanderhorst home. This time, Eleanor had been present, called into Marcus's study to witness what her husband described as the family's commitment to our future. Peter was there, visibly deteriorating, shaking and sweating despite the cool evening. Sheriff Pembroke was there, looking uncomfortable for the first time, and two other men whom Eleanor did not name but described as professionals in such matters, brought from Columbia where they were unknown in Charleston society. Marcus laid out the necessity, Eleanor wrote. Judge Grimble had evidence that could destroy us all. He had copies hidden in multiple locations. He had written detailed accounts of the conspiracy. He had scheduled a meeting with the state attorney general. The situation required, Marcus said, a permanent solution. And because Nathaniel had been clever enough to hide his evidence in multiple places, they needed to destroy not just the man, but all his papers, everything in his house that might contain proof. Fire was chosen as the method because it would destroy evidence while appearing accidental, or at least not immediately traceable to the conspiracy. The two professionals from Columbia were experienced in such work, Marcus assured the group. They would set fires in multiple locations simultaneously, creating a blaze that would spread too quickly for anyone to control. They would ensure that Nathaniel's study, where most of his recent work was stored, burned completely. Eleanor described her horror at hearing this plan, at watching her husband calmly discuss the murder of a man they had known for decades, whose wife they had already killed. She had finally spoken, asking Marcus if he understood what he was proposing, if he comprehended the magnitude of evil they were embracing. Marcus looked at me with what might have been pity, she wrote, and said, Eleanor, we passed the point of moral consideration when we acted in September. Now we're simply managing consequences. If you can't support this, you're welcome to leave Charleston and live quietly elsewhere with a generous allowance. But you cannot stay and become a liability. She had stayed, she admitted in her confession, because she lacked the courage to flee, because she feared the power Marcus wielded, because leaving would have required abandoning her home and everything she knew. I am writing this confession as my judgment of myself, Eleanor concluded this section. I was present when murder was planned, and I did nothing to prevent it. I am complicit in Judge Grimball's death as surely as if I had struck the match myself. I lived 20 more years carrying this knowledge, and I found no peace in any of them. The fire had been set on November 28th, just as Nathaniel was preparing his final documents for the Attorney General meeting. Eleanor described how Marcus had spent that evening at their home, establishing an alibi, hosting dinner guests who would testify he had been nowhere near Meeting Street when the flames began. She remembered looking across the dinner table at her husband, watching him charm their guests with stories and jokes, and thinking that she was dining with a monster wearing a gentleman's face. News of the fire reached them near midnight. Marcus had responded with appropriate shock and concern, had even organized men to help fight the flames, though by the time anyone arrived, the Grimball house was already consumed. I remember standing in our garden, Eleanor wrote, watching the orange glow in the sky where Meeting Street burned, and knowing that with that fire, truth itself was being reduced to ash. But truth, Eleanor revealed, was more resilient than the conspirators anticipated. Nathaniel Grimball, perhaps suspecting he might be in danger, had taken precautions. He had made multiple copies of his most important documents and distributed them to different locations. One set he had hidden in the courthouse itself, in a section of the archives where old estate records were stored, disguised among legitimate case files. Another set he had given to a trusted colleague, Judge Horatio Priolo, or so he thought. Priolo, it emerged, was himself compromised, and those documents never survived. But the third set, the one Nathaniel had sealed in an iron box and hidden in his own home's foundation, had been placed there weeks before the fire, during a period when the house was undergoing minor repairs and the foundation was temporarily exposed. Eleanor's confession explained that she learned of these hidden documents from Marcus, who spent years worrying about their potential discovery. He would wake at night, she wrote, gripped by fear that somewhere, in some archive or hidden location, Nathaniel Grimball's evidence still existed, waiting to expose us. That fear never left him, and I believe it contributed to his death in 1870. He died not peacefully, but in terror, calling out in his final delirium about fires and locked doors and eyes that watched him. The confession also addressed the other deaths that followed November 28th. Samuel's death, which had been reported as heart failure, was actually murder. Eleanor had overheard Marcus telling Sheriff Pembroke that the old butler knows too much and might talk to save others in the household. Samuel had been poisoned with the same concentrated laudanum used on Catherine and Isaiah, administered by Daniel Rutledge in the market, made to look like the natural death of an elderly man. Dinah's disappearance was more ambiguous. Eleanor wrote that Marcus had planned to kill her as well, but Dinah had somehow learned of the danger and fled. I hope she reached the north, Eleanor wrote. I hope she found freedom and lived long enough to forget what she witnessed. But I never knew, and Marcus never spoke of whether his men caught up with her. Some questions I lived with had no answers. And Peter, Eleanor's own son, her words about his death filled several pages, written in a hand that grew increasingly irregular, as if the act of writing about this particular loss physically pained her. Peter had deteriorated rapidly after Nathaniel's death, consuming laudanum in quantities that alarmed even his father. He spoke frequently, when drunk or drugged, about eyes that watched him, about Catherine Grimball appearing in his room at night, about Isaiah's hands reaching for him. Marcus grew concerned that Peter's deterioration would lead to public confession, that his son would reveal everything in a moment of drug-induced honesty or guilt-driven confession. On March 14, 1857, Eleanor wrote, "Peter died in his bedroom from what Marcus reported as accidental laudanum poisoning. But I knew the truth. I had seen Marcus enter Peter's room that evening with a bottle. I had heard Peter cry out once, then fall silent. When Marcus emerged, he looked at me with eyes that contained no grief, only calculation. He was suffering," Marcus told me. This was mercy. But it wasn't mercy. It was murder. The murder of our own son, to protect our position and prevent exposure. Eleanor's confession ended with reflections on justice and guilt, on the price of complicity and the weight of silence. She wrote about attending church every Sunday, kneeling in prayer, wondering if God could hear the prayers of someone who had allowed such evil to flourish. She described watching Charleston change through the war years, seeing the old order destroyed, and wondering if perhaps that destruction was itself a form of divine judgment, a cleansing fire that consumed the society that had produced and protected people like her husband. "I am dying now," her final paragraph read, "and I face whatever judgment awaits with this confession as my only offering. I did not have the courage to speak while it might have mattered, while justice might still have been served. I offer truth now only when it can harm no one but the dead, myself included soon enough. Let whoever reads this know what happened in Charleston in 1856. Let them know that beneath our beautiful homes and gracious manners, we were capable of monstrous evil. Let them judge us, since we would never judge ourselves." The discovery of Eleanor's confession in 1889 created an immediate dilemma for those who found it. Dr. Ravenel, examining the documents with the eye of a historian, recognized their significance immediately. But he also recognized the complications they presented. Many of the families mentioned, the Vanderhorsts, the Rutledges, the Colletons, still had living descendants in Charleston, prominent citizens whose reputations would be destroyed by the confession's revelations. After lengthy discussion, the three men who had witnessed the box's opening made a decision that itself became part of the tragedy's legacy. They chose to preserve the documents but not to make them immediately public. Instead, they deposited them in the Charleston County Archives with a seal requiring special permission to access them. The documents were catalogued and preserved but effectively hidden, available in theory, but unknown to all but a few. This decision was itself controversial when it later became known. Critics argued that truth delayed is truth denied, that the three men had prioritized social comfort over historical accuracy, that they had become complicit in the very cover-up they claimed to deplore. Defenders countered that in the Charleston of 1889, still recovering from war and Reconstruction, still rebuilding its social structures, the revelation of such a scandal would have caused damage out of proportion to any good it might achieve. The guilty were dead, justice was impossible, and truth served primarily to hurt the innocent descendants. The Charleston County Archives contain, in a sealed section accessible only with special permission, the complete Grimball case files, the original 4-line coroner's report, the sealed depositions from household servants, the petitions signed by 47 prominent citizens, and the documents discovered in 1889. Eleanor Vanderhorst's confession, Nathaniel Grimball's journals, his compiled evidence of the conspiracy. These materials were not widely accessible until 1934, when a graduate student named Margaret Sinclair, researching antebellum Charleston for her dissertation, discovered references to the sealed Grimball case in a footnote of a legal history text. Her persistent requests for access were initially denied, but after appealing to the State Historical Commission and demonstrating legitimate scholarly purpose, she became the first person outside the immediate circle of 1889 to read Eleanor's full confession. Sinclair's subsequent dissertation, Murder, Conspiracy and Justice in Antebellum Charleston, The Grimball Tragedy Reconsidered, presented the evidence to an academic audience for the first time. Her work was thorough, careful, and devastating in its implications. She traced not only the conspiracy around the Beaumont land case, but connections to similar patterns of corruption and violence throughout the antebellum South. The Grimble case, she argued, was not an aberration, but an example, perhaps unusually well documented but representative of how power actually functioned in a society built on fundamental injustice. Her work met resistance. Several Charleston families whose ancestors were named in Eleanor's confession attempted to block publication of Sinclair's dissertation. When that failed, they commissioned their own historians to write rebuttals, questioning Eleanor's mental state when she wrote the confession, suggesting she might have been confused or motivated by spite, proposing alternative explanations for the events of 1856. None of these rebuttals gained significant traction in scholarly circles, but they succeeded in their real purpose, creating enough doubt in popular understanding that the simple, scandalous version of events, the forbidden affair, the tragic deaths, remained the dominant narrative in Charleston's collective memory. Historians who have studied these materials recognize the Grimble tragedy as one of the clearest examples of how Southern justice operated in the antebellum period. Not through law, but through power. Not through truth, but through convenient narrative. The case reveals the mechanisms by which Charleston's elite maintained control. Violence when necessary, but violence disguised. Violence that reinforced rather than challenged the existing social order. Catherine Grimble and Isaiah were murdered not because they violated any moral boundary, but because Catherine's husband refused to participate in a land fraud scheme. Their deaths were political assassinations, dressed in the clothes of scandal to make them serve double duty, eliminating opposition while reinforcing racial and social hierarchies. The genius of the conspiracy was in making the victims' own reputations serve as both weapon and shield, creating a narrative that Charleston society would embrace because it confirmed what they already believed or wanted to believe. Nathaniel Grimble understood this, and it broke him. According to his journal, he spent his final weeks paralyzed by a terrible paradox. To reveal the truth about the murders would require him to subject Catherine's reputation to even more scrutiny, to prove she was innocent by demonstrating how thoroughly she had been framed, which meant publicly examining her life in ways that played into the conspirators' hands, regardless of what that examination revealed. He could either protect Catherine's memory or seek justice for her death, but the way his enemies had structured the crime made it nearly impossible to do both. He chose justice anyway, and it cost him his life. But even that sacrifice proved insufficient. The truth emerged too late and incomplete. No trials were held, no punishments administered, no real accountability demanded. Just historical footnotes and scholarly articles that few read, archived documents that fewer still request access to see. The Meeting Street property where the Grimble house once stood is now a law office, ironically enough. The firm of Henderson, Wright and Associates, specializing in real estate law. A small plaque outside notes that Judge Nathaniel Grimble once lived there, though it mentions nothing about the circumstances of his death or the tragedy that consumed his household. Charleston tour guides occasionally mention the Grimble tragedy during their historical walks, but they invariably tell the official story, the scandalous affair, the murder-suicide, the forbidden love that ended in death. The comfortable lie persists because it's simpler than the complicated truth, because it requires no reassessment of Charleston's past, because it makes no demands on the present. In Magnolia Cemetery, Catherine Grimble's grave bears her name, her birth and death dates, and a single line, "Faithful wife, devoted to duty." The inscription was chosen by her sister, and its quiet dignity stands in contrast to the scandal that briefly surrounded Catherine's death. Nathaniel's grave, added after the fire, sits beside hers. His inscription reads, Nathaniel Grimble, Judge, 1807-1856. He loved justice more than life. No one knows who chose those words, but they serve as a kind of code, a message to anyone who knows the real story. No mention is made of Isaiah anywhere in the cemetery. He lies in an unmarked grave in the enslaved section, a part of Magnolia that has fallen into disrepair, where weeds grow tall and most markers have long since disappeared. He is one of thousands of enslaved people whose existence was recorded only as property, whose death was noted only as financial loss. In the Grimball estate settlement, his value was listed as $1,200. His death recorded in the same ledger column as a broken carriage and a lame horse. The Vanderhorst family tomb, by contrast, is an impressive marble structure near the cemetery's main avenue, well maintained, bearing the names of Marcus, Eleanor, and Peter, along with several generations before and after. Marcus's inscription notes his distinguished service to Charleston's legal community and his dedication to preserving Southern institutions. Nothing suggests the murders he orchestrated, the lives he destroyed, the conspiracy he led. Eleanor's inscription reads simply, "Beloved wife and mother," with no hint of the confession she wrote or the guilt that consumed her final years. Peter's grave bears only his name and dates, the brevity perhaps reflecting his father's final act of mercy, saying nothing rather than inventing virtues the son never possessed. History, as written in marble, tells only the stories that power once remembered. The Vanderhorsts are honored, their crimes concealed beneath respectability. The Grimballs are reduced to a tragic footnote, their victimhood transformed into scandal. And Isaiah is erased entirely, reduced from a human being with thoughts, feelings, and dignity to a nameless participant in a morality tale about forbidden desires. But paper preserves what stone conceals. In the Charleston County Archives, in the libraries of several historical societies, in the collections of universities that study the antebellum South, the evidence exists for those willing to look. The truth is available, though it requires effort to find, to piece together, to understand. It requires believing that official narratives might conceal rather than reveal, that respectable people commit terrible crimes, that justice delayed is not merely justice denied, but evidence of systemic corruption. The Grimball tragedy teaches us that in societies built on fundamental injustice, even individual acts of conscience become dangerous. Nathaniel Grimball tried to be a good judge in a bad system, and the system destroyed him for it. Catherine Grimball died not for any sin she committed, but because she was vulnerable, available to be used as a weapon against her husband. Isaiah died because his position as an enslaved man made him the perfect scapegoat, someone whose victimization would be not only accepted but expected, whose humanity could be denied, even in death. Their story should make us ask difficult questions about our own time, our own society, our own complicity in systems that protect the powerful and sacrifice the vulnerable. But asking such questions is uncomfortable, and comfort is what most people seek from history. So the simple version persists, the scandal, the forbidden love, the inevitable tragedy. Fiction serving the interests of those who benefited from the crime, even generations later. Yet the truth remains, waiting in archives and historical records, preserved by people like Eleanor Vanderhorst, who lacked the courage to speak when it mattered, but found the strength to write what they could not say. It waits for researchers like Margaret Sinclair, who refused to accept comfortable narratives and demanded to see the sealed records. It waits for anyone willing to look beyond the plaques and the tour guide stories, anyone willing to ask why some cases are sealed while others remain open, why some truths are preserved while others are erased. The Grimball house burned in 1856, but the evidence survived in its foundation, hidden but preserved, waiting decades to emerge. Perhaps that's the lesson. Truth is more resilient than we imagine. It can be suppressed, delayed, obscured, but it has a tendency to survive, to resurface, to demand recognition even from generations who would prefer to forget. The dead do not stop speaking, and the crimes of the past continue to echo, continue to raise questions that no amount of comfortable mythology can fully silence. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you suspect there are still secrets buried in Charleston's past, truths too dangerous or too uncomfortable to fully excavate? The Grimball case took decades to emerge from sealed archives. How many other cases remain sealed? How many other truths wait to be discovered? Leave your comment below and tell us what you think about how history decides which stories to preserve and which to bury. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark mysteries from America's hidden history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves stories that challenge comfortable narratives. The past is never really past, and the dead never stop speaking to those willing to listen.